Hey guys, welcome back to another video. Today we have a very special guest. We're here with Professor Bart Kay, and we're going to be discussing the topic of endurance and long distance athletes and performance on a carnivore diet and how that sort of works. So, hey Bart,
Hey, how you doing?
good. Yeah, so do you want to sort of get straight into it and talk about, is it possible for an athlete a long form athlete specifically to perform well on a zero carbohydrate diet?
Yeah, that's a real easy one. The straightforward, unequivocal, absolutely definite answer to that is yes. Even if you are an athlete of any kind, be that endurance athlete or a power athlete or a strength athlete or a team sport, doesn't matter what kind of athlete you are or whether you're a non-athlete, it makes no difference. The exact requirement for carbohydrates in your diet is not 1 single gram ever. None at all. The reason being is because human beings have a metabolic pathway called gluconeogenesis, which will produce all the glucose that is required by that person's body from non-glucose sources, mostly the backbones of fatty acids that have been broken down to use for oxidative energy. There's always this glycerol backbone left over, and that can be transmuted by gluconeogenesis back to sugar, which can then enter your bloodstream, and then your muscles will extract that glucose from your bloodstream and make glycogen out of that. Jobs are good and we're done. Easy. No carbs needed.
Right, so our body can make its own carbohydrates or glucose through our own body through protein. So how come a lot of the mainstream media or like even at school in PDHPE class, which is physical health and education, they told us that you need to be carb loading, you need to be eating lots of carbs so then you'll have more energy for the next day. Why do you think that is the case?
It's ignorance, it's stupidity, it's a complete lack of understanding of metabolic process, human physiology, integrated function of the human body. It's just rubbish, and it's bought and paid for by those with vested interests in making sure that people eat a lot of carbohydrate-based so-called foods. Big agriculture has an interest in that. Big pharma has an interest in that, because also that'll tend to destroy your health and make you behooven to the pharmacological business for their drugs that will control your symptoms that are caused by eating carbohydrates, for example. It's those interests that often pay the nutrition schools and the medical schools to teach students absolute nonsense and to completely ignore the fact that gluconeogenesis exists and works perfectly well.
Right. But a lot of people would say that just because gluconeogenesis does exist, it doesn't actually produce enough glucose to give you sufficient energy for a long distance event. And how come all these like really, really good athletes, they're in the top teams, have professional staff? How come surely they would know the truth and wouldn't just be smashing carbs down their throat if it wasn't optimal?
Yeah. Okay, a couple of things there. Number one, that is still false. Gluconeogenesis can and does provide all the glucose that is required. A person's resting glycogen level in their muscle cells is a training status determined factor, not a dietary factor.
Really?
Well, that's true until someone is in full starvation. If you're in full starvation, you might have a compromise of your resting glycogen level. But until that, no, doesn't happen. The second part about athletes, if what I was saying was true, wouldn't athletes be doing that? Well, as an exercise physiologist, myself first and foremost, actually, as someone who studied that before anything else, as someone who did work and still does work with athletes, both professional and semi-professional at the highest levels, what I can tell you are there are a number of both professional and sub-professional athletes who are indeed competing on a fully carnivorous diet with no carbohydrate intake to speak of, who are smashing it. Now, that being the case, are those athletes likely to jump up on their soapbox or scream that from the rooftops and tell all their competitors? No, of course they're not.
Yeah.
So that's why it doesn't happen.
So if we're not using carbs for energy, then where does our body get our energy from? Does it get it from dietary fat or more the fat that we're storing? Yeah.
Okay, so when you are undertaking exercise and the muscle cells are working, they are exerting force on your skeleton to produce movement. In terms of the oxidative supply of energy, in terms of what the mitochondria is oxidizing to water plus carbon dioxide plus ATP, there are two main sources of energy that your body can use, and they are fat and carbohydrate.
Yeah.
In an absolute emergency, protein can be used for that as well, but your body's not going to use a significant amount of protein at all until there is no fat or carbohydrate to be had. Why?
Okay.
That would be ridiculous. Of course, it's not going to. So that's that part of the energy. Now, the reason that the mitochondria are oxidizing substrates to produce that energy is in order that that energy can be shuttled through the cell to the contractile proteins in the muscle fibers. And those contractile proteins only have one choice for fuel, and that is glycogen, which is glucose starch. They cannot run on fat, they cannot run on protein, they cannot run on alcohol. It must be glucose for a muscle cell to contract. So what happens is, in the series of events in a muscle cell, let's say this is a muscle cell that is contracting once every second rhythmically during some aerobic event of some kind. So the muscle fiber is sat there, it's fully charged up, it's fully ready to go, it's got a full complement of glycogen. The mitochondria are doing their thing, oxidizing for energy at a steady sort of rate that rolls at about the same amount over time. Then in the first part of that second, this is when the muscle contraction is going to occur, and that cell will twitch and it will go bam. And it contracts fully, completely, at full power, or not at all. And that whole process, bam, to contract and relax and resolution, depending on muscle cell type, ranges between 10 and 40 milliseconds. During that time, there is a huge, vast, massive use of glycogen, which is used to fire that muscle contraction. Then the muscle cell has something like 960 to 990 milliseconds, so somewhere between 96 and 99% of its time is spent getting energy from the mitochondria shuttled across and rebuilding the glycogen store up so that that muscle can twitch again, because it uses basically all of its stored glycogen on a single twitch. And so really the energy system, the one and only one energy system, is this. Oxidative phosphorylation in the mitochondria produces energy, and it does that by oxidizing fats and carbohydrates. That energy is shuttled from the mitochondria to the contractile proteins using a system called the phosphocreatine or PCR system.
Right. So
and then glycogenolysis is used to fire the contractions themselves.
So you don't believe in the whole aerobic, anaerobic, lactic acid system and stuff?
Well, they are all components of a one and only one system, an integrated system. Each one of those factors is like a gear in a gearbox that if you remove that gear, the whole gearbox becomes useless. It will not work.
Okay.
You do not have three energy systems. You have one.
You have one, but they sort of compass the whole three together.
So all three of those so-called systems, and they're not systems, they're components of a system. All three are vital components of the workings of that system. Take any one of those out and the whole system fails immediately. A single muscle twitch, bam, you're done. That muscle fiber is now completely expended, and it will now, within the next 4.5 minutes, it will die. It will become permanently locked up and it will die if you take any one of those three systems out of play.
Okay. So do you think if there was a zero carb athlete, say me, I'm on a carnivore diet and say I'm going to the gym and I'm trying to put on muscle and improve my performance, do you think that someone in my shoes would benefit from adding in a more digestible, like a white rice carbohydrate, or
No,
you
not
think
at
it's,
all. No, that's a bad idea. You should not do that, in fact.
yeah,
People that espouse the idea that you require carbohydrates in order to get an insulin spike, in order to drive protein into your muscles, do not understand that protein in sufficient quantity is in and of itself insulinogenic and gluconeogenic.
yeah.
So the exact need for intake for carbohydrates in the diet, irrespective of what kind of athlete you are, is still none at all.
Okay. So to sort of summarize the thing, so my sort of question was, say if you've got a soccer player, right? He plays a lot of soccer and he eats a lot of carbohydrates, and he says to me, I can't go on a carnivore diet because I need carbohydrates to function well and perform well. Then what would you say to that besides obviously that you don't need it? What would you say, like you get your energy from the fat or your body makes its own glycogen through training?
Well, if I was in your situation and an athlete said that to me, I would link them to this video that we're recording right now and say, watch this video. Watch it as many times as you need to until you understand. Professor Kay explains it very, very clearly. You do not need carbohydrates to perform well in sport. That said, an athlete who has been eating a lot of carbohydrates, who changes to a low carbohydrate diet,
Yeah.
will experience a decrease in their performance for a short period of time while their body readjusts. That's normal.
Yeah.
But when you emerge from that trough in performance, your performance returns to where it was or better, is what I've found with athletes that I'm working with.
Okay. So your body, so say if you're a fat adapted athlete, your body mainly uses fat for energy, or I know you already explained this, but just more in simpler terms.
Sure. Yeah. So a fat adapted athlete tends to use more fat at the mitochondria than carbohydrate.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay. So the whole like carb loading thing, could you do similar with like fat loading, or it's just total nonsense, the loading?
Not really. I mean, your body will store fat in globules in your muscle cells if your intake of fat is such that that's likely to occur. And that's fine because that fat can be used at any stage by those muscles to be oxidized for energy. So, I mean, the short answer is yeah, absolutely. I mean, your body decides to store fat when the conditions are right for fat storage in muscle cells. That's quite distinct from your body deciding to store fat in your fat cells because you've taken in too much energy or too much mass of food, I should say. It's got nothing to do with energy, in fact. It's just a term that's very hard for us to get rid of because we've used it for so long. We think of our food as an energy source. No, it's a source of mass.
Okay, so you know how like your body uses carbohydrate, or this is at least what I've been taught. Your body uses carbs first, then fats and proteins.
Yeah.
So in the case of me and you, are fat adapted humans, would we still use the carbohydrates from gluconeogenesis first and then the fat?
Well, what happens is the rate at which your body is producing glucose and adding it into your bloodstream, the thing that primarily determines the rate of gluconeogenesis is the rate at which glucose is being drawn down out of your blood by your tissues. So if your muscle cells are actively using glucose or using glucose to build glycogen, that's lowering the level of glucose in your blood. And then that message is passed on through the fact that your blood glucose is dropping. And then other tissues in your body that are involved in making glucose go, right, we need to make more glucose. And so we use glycerol backbones, one or two gluconeogenic amino acids can be used, and also monocarboxylates like lactate can be used for that purpose as well. And so it sets to and it starts making glucose, all in order to keep your blood glucose level very, very stable.
Okay, so the glycogen in your muscles is more so determined by your training frequency because you're telling your body it needs more glycogen rather than the dietary intake of
Correct. That's it.
carbohydrates.
Muscle glycogen, resting muscle glycogen level is a training status influenced factor, not a dietary factor. So loading yourself up with carbohydrates will not help.
Okay. And how long do you think that it will take for the sort of mainstream the mainstream sport and exercise movement, I guess, to sort of hear this message more and maybe switch to more lower inflammatory diets to help
Yeah.
their
Yeah.
athletes?
Okay. The answer to this one is quite simple, and it's an answer that I discovered and understood about 25, 26 years ago, whatever it was, when my professor, when I was an undergraduate, said the following thing to me, and I immediately understood, and hopefully your people will too. He said to me this when I asked him a similar question: how long until we can get people to understand this? And he said, you need to understand that science and the way science is communicated progresses one funeral at a time.
Understood.
Yeah. If I'm an academic, and I am, and I've built a career on a certain line of saying this is how something is and this is what we should take out of that and how we should do things, as soon as I plant that flag in that hill as an academic, I am now required to defend that hill to the death.
Yeah.
And I will, because it's my credibility that's on the line as an academic.
Yeah.
That's why science. Well, that and the fact that science is bought and paid for.
Yeah.
Who pays for science? Science costs money to do, a lot of money. Who pays for that? Industry.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
All right, my man. I think that covers
yeah,
us.
yeah. No, that definitely explains it, because personally, as someone who trains a lot, I feel like my performance is massively improved on a carnivore diet.
Yep.
Lower inflammation, better clarity, and
Yep.
so yeah, thanks for explaining that, Bart. Really appreciated that. Hopefully you guys can get some value from that if any of you guys are long distance athletes or just, trying to understand how our body actually uses these fat and carbohydrates. So yeah, where can our viewers find you, Bart, and check out more of your
Yeah,
information?
absolutely. Real easy. What you do is you go to the YouTubes and you punch in at BART-KAY. Easy. Yeah.
I'll leave a link below as well to Bart's YouTube channel and all these websites and that. Yeah, thanks so much for coming on today, Bart, and we'll catch you guys in the next one.
Excellent. Pleasure, young man, young man. See you then.
So.